I'll start with Jennifer. Can you envision, you're optimistic, you've said you're optimistic that it's not hopeless, but like, can you sort of frame scenarios where in fact real change comes to an institution that may not be fit for purpose or could be fixed? Like how does a coalition form that gets the world to repair some of this?
Okay, I'm going to start with the negative and then move on, because I am going to pick up with what John said. I think for me, the concern is that first and foremost, it takes U.S. leadership, and right now we don't have it in terms of real leadership to reform the WTO, because I do think the Biden administration has lost faith in the WTO, again, largely because of this perception that if the WTO can't fix our problems with China, it's not worth fixing. So I will say, I think there is an issue there, and I won't disagree with the concern is, we need time. And my problem is, with respect to climate change, we don't have time. We have to do something now about climate change. So I'm going to say that, how do you envision reform coming about? I mean, first of all, a couple of good things are, A, right now the WTO is an incredibly capable, engaged, dynamic leader in Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala from Nigeria. She is fantastic and has been able to almost pull, constantly rabbits out of a hat. So you've got strong leadership within the WTO itself. You have, I think, a lot of the rest of the parts of the WTO are still really functioning. I mean, the committees that meet, the people that get together, and the WTO does still serve as a place in which people from different walks, if you will, different countries, actually get together and speak to one another and learn something. So there is a whole part of the WTO, if you want to look up anybody in the world's tariff schedule or other things. So a lot of that basic functioning is working well. So then how do we get to these reforms? To me, it is perhaps picking up on your idea, some small areas where you could see victories. And as you start to see victories, then the WTO becomes more relevant. And the two victories that could come reasonably, I could at least imagine. One is an agreement on what do we do about all the plastics that are accumulating in terms of plastic waste. We have literally islands of plastics out in the ocean. So again, using those trade tools to try to figure out how do we create some real disciplines on, curbing the production ever of virgin plastic and pushing the idea that you have to go to recycling. There's a lot of work being done. The second one is on fossil fuel subsidies, where again, there is a big push to try to think about at least disciplining the production subsidies. So I'm hoping that if you can get a few of these smaller victories, people start to say the WTO is worth it, even if its role is not the grandiose role that we might have imagined, many years ago.
John?
So I would have a different perspective in that, right? We're worried about credibility. I'm not worried about the credibility of the WTO within the economics department at MIT, say. I'm worried about the credibility of the WTO among manufacturing communities in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or Michigan, agricultural communities in California, Missouri, South Carolina, and the credibility for those that represent those communities. And if I'm a member of Congress, Democrat or Republican from any of those areas, and I open the newspaper because I'm old school and I still open the newspaper, and I read that the WTO is decided that the way we treat the taxation of oil depletion or gas pipelines in America is wrong, that's it. I've had it with the WTO. That's not their job. I'm just talking as the perspective of a member of Congress would be. Why can't they just resolve that dumping issue or that trade issue that my district or my state has had in front of them for 3 years? So to me, the credibility is reestablished first, and it can be small. I'm not asking nothing big, but reestablish itself as a mechanism for resolving disputes, specific trade disputes. Then I think, once you have credibility, You can move on to issues that, honestly, I'm very empathetic to the issue of the plastics, and pollution. But I don't think those that created the WTO and supported its creation in 1993 ever thought that that would be the issue that the WTO should deal with to restore its credibility.
I'm going to add one thing to just
Sure,
sort of
sure.
come into arguably violent agreement with what you've just said, because I do think you have seen, and again, you witness it very clearly, a sense of whether or not members of Congress, again, and their constituencies sort of care about the WTO. During the financial crisis, there was this idea of creating a so-called cash for clunkers program where you would create a tax incentive to buy back old cars. And at the time of the debate, the issue was raised on the floor of the Senate. Is this going to cover foreign cars? And the response from Senator Barbara Mikulski from Maryland was, of course it's going to cover foreign cars. Otherwise, it would violate our WTO obligations. Fast forward now to the Inflation Reduction Act, which has in it, as Senator Sununu has just said, this idea of you only get an electric vehicle tax credit if the vehicle was assembled in North America. Well, that is a total violation of the WTO rules, all right? Did anyone in the room say, oh, we can't do that because it would violate our WTO obligations, at least as far as I understand it? Answer to that question, no, because no longer does anyone really care about whether or not we are, or no one, I shouldn't say no one, that there is a larger group within the United States that isn't caring about adherence to those obligations.
So, and to that point, the WTO actually acting through its processes to strike that down, find that provision in violation. It may anger some members of Congress, but it would help restore credibility. There's something to be said for building credibility. If I say, you're going to get to my child, you're going to get in trouble if you do X, and they do X and they get in trouble, they're not happy about it, but I've established credibility going both ways. And so I'm with you. If this is a violation of WTO, the WTO should stand up for itself, or other countries should stand up for themselves and find us in violation, restore that credibility.
Just before taking the first question from the audience, I just want to drill a little bit deeper, take both these strands of what we're talking about and drill deeper into what John was talking about. We need leadership. I think implicit in your plea for more leadership is you do see, in your mind, a benefit toward getting more deals done right with perhaps other countries. And when I was talking to Jennifer, I was talking about fixing the WTO, a different type of leadership. So let me phrase it this way. If a fiendish professor at University of Maine at Orono with bright students were to assign an essay question based on everything you've learned at the Camden Conference this weekend, if you turn, what do you need to be, 34 and a half to be president? If you're crafting a platform to deal with trade policy someday in your life based on this information, how do you make an argument now that would bolster leadership toward, in your case, let's do some more deals, in your case, let's fix the trading system? Like what, it's not, we've heard so many countervailing ideas. What is the actual pitch that leadership could use?
Start small,
Yeah.
number one. I just threw out, Central America, North Africa, South Asia, identify maybe a few select areas. We're talking about the free trade agreement with Korea last night, and it was very narrow. But at the same time, it moves the process forward in the right direction. Even before that, look, if I'm a politician today and I'm talking about trade, where you start? Enforcement, right? So, you start talking about these enforcement mechanisms, and basically with a platform for improving them, restoring credibility, and move from there. And then, you have to, third thing I'd say is you have to be able to talk about both the economic value, but also the economic cost that Professor Otter was talking about yesterday, and the dislocation and how we can do better to the extent that those exist or are created as a result of a new trade initiative. So can it be done? Yes. But I'm also the first to say this is not top of mind for 98% of the electorate in the United States today. It just isn't.
The first part isn't. The help for dealing with trade might be.
I think, yes, to a certain extent. I mean, look, but if you talk about trade, the national security implications of issues and sanctions on China, set that aside. That is foremost. But it depends on the community you're in when you talk about trade assistance and other things.
Yeah. Dr. Hillman?
Two comments really quickly. One, was to think about the messaging. I'm sort of reminded of that you don't know what you've got until it's gone. Because at some level, I think it is, reminding people that at its core, what the WTO and its rules system is doing is protecting us against discrimination. And so if you don't have those basic rules, you could easily imagine countries around the world deciding that they're going to start putting on, let's say, a 10% surcharge on all American goods because they've decided that the United States' value of the dollar is such that it's not fair to them, so they're going to start putting on, again, some kind of tariff, quota, restraint. They just don't like American or American goods, or they say our tech companies, Google and everybody, are too big, and therefore they're going to put a surcharge on all U.S. goods. We will lose those protections against discrimination if we simply let the rules-based trading system go away. So it's a little bit, to me, of a reminder. And then the second thing I think is the really hardest part of thinking about trade policy, which is, again, that issue of what do you do for those that are harmed by it. And there, I think the problem is the trading rules are not really dealing with how to distribute the gains from trade. That is a domestic policy issue. And yet the failure to do that is placed at the feet of the trading system. So the trading system gets blamed for the fact that we have not done a very good job of figuring out the distribution of the gains, and that we have, and again, this is the other problem within the trading world, is we're outliers in terms of how great the income, the wealth inequality gap is in the United States. Yes, it has grown elsewhere, but it is nothing like it is here in the United States in most of the other G7 countries, where the gap between the wealthiest and the least wealthy is not so great. Here in the United States, we have, again, if you look at the indexes that would look at this, we are out of proportion with the rest of the world, which I think makes it harder for us, because that is what people are reacting to. That is what everyone is reacting to, is this perception that trade has taken away my jobs, trade has destroyed my community, all the things that David Otter talked about. That's the real perception. And there isn't as much a perception. And so what has the trading system done for me? And so that's where I think we need to do a little bit more of trying to find those examples of this is what the trading system's done.
Brazil and South Africa, it's worse, he said, proving Dr. Hillman's point. We have volunteer one. You have going to a raised hand?
Yeah.
Remind us, this is one of the stars from yesterday.
Ajay Chibber. I hesitate to even speak with all these trade experts around, and I'm not a trade expert, but I much appreciate your remarks, Senator Sununu, especially your realism on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I think will take a long time to get in place. But I wanted to ask, and also what Mark said yesterday about the penalties being in the WTO being so meaningless that even if you had the rules, etc., then no pain there, no pain, no gain, as they say. But in the 2 days we've had here, I've never heard the word RCEP. I know the Chinese-led regional trading agreement that was just signed, which covers almost the whole of Asia except India. It's a very large agreement that has just been signed, and it will affect whether TPP returns or not, and a whole So I just wanted to raise this issue: is that how do you all view the RCEP? So the Chinese have not waited; they've gone ahead and made progress on the regional agreements, the kind of thing that you're suggesting. That, in fact, it's not such a small step; it's quite a large step for Asia, and Korea and Japan and all have joined in as well. So, how do you all view RCEP? Does that?
Yeah, is this a tool to say, hey, we got to keep up with the Chinese?
Yes. I'm not familiar with the terms of the agreement, I'm sorry. But I think one of the stronger possible arguments for re-engaging on TPP, now CTPP, would be to provide that counter in the Pacific region to ensure that our trading counterparts, one, are as aligned as possible with our economic interests, but also, the provisions like intellectual property that were ultimately, I think, stripped out of the TPP when it was resuscitated. The United States would obviously like to see that included in any Pacific agreement. But the counter against Japan from an economic and a security standpoint would be a very strong argument for re-engaging.
I'll only add that I think part of the reason, at least, you don't always hear as much about it is because it isn't, in that sense, a free trade agreement, which generally means that everybody has lowered their tariffs down to zero. So the RCEP, the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, is an agreement among China, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the ASEAN nations. So again, it covers about a third of the population of the world, about a third of the GDP of the world. What is significant, which I think you're right, is flying under the radar here in the United States, is what is the rules of origin. In other words, what goods get to trade under the rules that the RCEP has set up. And they are cumulative rules. In other words, you can make a part in Malaysia and then something else in Vietnam and then something in Japan and then some part of it in Korea, and it all trades then among these RCEP countries, which includes China. So again, this is very substantial. So what the effect of RCEP is doing is, again, to significantly integrate the amount of intra-Asian trade. And the longer RCEP goes without us having any counterpart of any kind in Asia, the stronger that intra-Asian bloc becomes. And I think the harder it is for the US or others to think about how are they going to get access into that market when everybody in it has learned to trade under these cumulated RCEP rules of origin. So in that sense, I think it is a very substantial agreement that we're not paying attention to.
I think we should rebrand some of these acronyms things. And RCEP can be tangerine, TPP can be banana, something. There's a volunteer number 2 with a question on that side.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. I'm Andrew Morier from Northeastern University in Boston. My main research that I've been doing is the intersection of Arctic governance and international and environmental security issues. So I understand that I'm a couple of conferences behind for this question. But Professor Hillman, you mentioned regional trade and regional agreements, like regionalization rather than globalization. Russia and China are kind of in this little friendship bubble regarding the Northern Sea Route and interest in the shipping lane that's opening up due to the melting ice caps and so forth, which brings up a lot of security and environmental issues. And I wanted to ask you how you think that would kind of tie in to your talk if you were able to do like a small little like segment 2 conferences ago with and Senator Sununu to kind of tie in the congressional aspect to it. The late Dean of the House, Don Young, and I believe Senator King from this state also floated the idea of an Arctic ambassador. And I wanted to kind of ask why congressionally that tends to go nowhere every time it kind of gets brought up, and what the barriers to it would be, and why, since there's such a national security implication with the stability of the Arctic, why does it keep going kind of without being talked about.
So, Professor Hillman, thoughts about trade policy and the new trade route up through the Arctic? Anything?
So the honest answer is generally trade rules don't often govern the issues about shipping lanes, et cetera. There's a separate entire set of treaties under the ICAO, the International Convention on shipping. Sorry. Yeah, it's a whatever, a melon. Anyway, there's a separate organization that governs that. But I will say, the whole opening up has raised a whole series of issues. Like, for example, do we want to be careful starting from the get-go about thinking about putting restraints on vessels moving with bunker fuel through the Arctic, since a spill in the Arctic would be so much worse than others? Should we start pushing the idea that you have to have less fossil fuels, even other kinds of shipping vehicles, if we're going to open up these really sensitive areas? It's raised a huge set of issues under the law of the sea over who governs those spaces, because there's a lot of disputed territory, and the general rules are very complicated in terms of that administration of those so-called exclusive economic zones. So all I know is there's a lot of controversy around it, a lot of difficulty, and it's not a trade issue. So you have to go to another organization in order to figure out how to do it, and that probably raises a whole series of other issues.
So, John, can politicians get too interested?
Well, just on the ambassador issue, I don't know exactly what their roles and responsibilities would be. I'm sure it's in the legislation that Angus and Don Young put together. It's hard for presidents to get all of their existing ambassadorial nominations approved. So I just don't think there's a lot of momentum for creating another position, even if we felt, well, there may be some important engagement that person could have. There are other mechanisms for the administration, to engage through their various councils on the Arctic, Economic Council, National Economic Policy, et cetera. So if I were a member of Congress from Florida, that just wouldn't be very high on my priority list. And the fact is, you need to get a majority to move something like that through.
Riley Worth, who's a participant not here in the hall here with us, sent one in. What will it take to make climate change an important issue for both parties? You could slightly rephrase it. What would make it more urgent for both parties? I'm sure it's important for both.
Well, right, that suggests that no one thinks it's urgent in either or both parties. I think, look, the biggest divide is on how urgent and how do you address it. So, and I'll just give one example. The biggest contributor to the decline in carbon emissions in the United States over the last 15 years, which has been quite significant, has been the replacement of coal-fired plants with natural gas. They just produce significantly less carbon, and the drop has been quite dramatic. So, if I want to continue that pace, then I, as a legislator, would want to do things that make it easier to produce, transmit, ship, utilize natural gas as a substitute fuel for oil and for coal. And, I think that's a realistic approach. It's not the only approach. But if someone on the other side of the aisle might say, no, the only solution is a carbon tax. We have to have a carbon tax. That's the only solution. If you don't support a carbon tax, you don't think this is an urgent problem. Do they both think it's important? Yes. Do they both have solutions to try to address it? Yes. Are they bitterly divided and polarized? Yes. But I think you have to sort of be thoughtful. If you really want to engage on this issue and be thoughtful, you have to recognize that across the whole spectrum, there are a lot of different solutions. And just because someone doesn't agree with your approach doesn't mean they don't care about the issue.
Professor Hillman?
I'd only add two quick things. One is, I think at least, many would say that the Inflation Reduction Act is the single, by far, largest expenditure by the United States in an effort to fight climate change. So it isn't true that nothing is happening on the United States. So again, I think that is a huge investment in renewable energy and electric vehicles, et cetera. So in that sense, you can say a lot has been done. A lot of money has been allocated, and a lot of efforts.
Because it's in violation of the WTO, though, but don't tell anybody.
But that was my second point, is it points out that we are in a bit of this clash where the United States' approach to fighting climate change appears unequivocally to be a combination of subsidies and regulation. And the approach in Europe and in many other places is largely around a carbon price and regulation. But clearly, there's the potential for those two systems to really come into conflict. And so part of the thing to me that's really urgent is that we find ways to agree to disagree, or at least to say, as long as we're both headed in the same place and we both are meeting the same goals, the fact that we're getting there through different roads should not be the subject of trade disputes, and try to figure out that peace clause, or that way to mutually recognize what each other is doing as equally valid, is part of what I would take as your message onto the international trade scene.
Hardworking volunteer one, I think you've identified a hand. Another familiar face from yesterday.
Hi, my name's Mark. I'm from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I just wanted to follow up on the question on RCEP and to touch on the issue that I think oftentimes we think trade is about tariffs, but the point that I think I and others made yesterday was really in the 21st century, making trade fit for purpose of the 21st century. It's really about rules of origin. And I think Dr. Hillman's comments here really highlight why that's the case, right? What's significant about this new intra-Asian China-led trade deal is not the tariffs, but the rules of origin, right? And the accumulation effects and so forth. So I wanted to ask, to tie this back to waking up the Muppet in terms of the TPP. One of the things I think is not talked about nearly enough about the TPP is it has really weak rules of origin for certain manufacturing goods, and particularly as was highlighted yesterday when it comes to textiles, automotives, and some of the most job-intensive parts for certain communities. And so I just wanted to ask, for those who think about what's necessary in terms of revising the TPP, would you agree that it would be a mistake to rejoin its CPTPP in its current form because it has such weak rules of origin that essentially it provides a loophole for Chinese goods to come in via Japan or Vietnam or Australia and so forth, especially now with RCEP in place? And if you would agree, why do you think we're not doing more to put pressure on our allies to actually put forward a revised version of this CPTPP that would actually be something that would force Washington to engage with, rather than have this just be the excuse?
So maybe an overhaul, not just a resurrection. What do people think?
So to answer the last part first, the reason there's not a lot of engagement on it is simply because it's still a little too hot to handle. I mean, the plug was pulled in 2017. Obviously, it was a no-go zone for the Trump administration, and even now, because of the decisions made in the Biden administration to sort of continue most of the Trump trade policies, it's just not a fertile environment, political environment, domestic political environment for re-engaging, I think. And so that's why you haven't seen it. It's just still a little too hot, at least to do so publicly. Privately, quietly, perhaps. But then to your earlier point, I mentioned intellectual property, but certainly rules of origin. I think these are two things that the United States would almost certainly insist on as negotiating points if and when we were to re-engage, and look no further than the content provisions that were in the Inflation Reduction Act. That's obviously a mechanism, rightly or wrongly, that members of Congress on both sides think is an important element of the trade dialogue right now.
Jennifer, the idea of maybe more rules of origin and a revamped?
Well, again, I would completely agree that it's going to be really important, because otherwise it does become the backdoor for China. The only thing I would add is that I think right now it's really clear that the Biden team sees this Indo-Pacific economic framework as the alternative to TPP, and they're putting a lot of their effort into that. And because it does not involve tariff negotiations, it does not include rules of origin, but what it does try to do is to figure out how to map out supply chains across all of the IPEF countries and try to figure out, again, where are those choke points, where are the bottlenecks, how could you create workarounds for any of the choke points that are there in order to move in this direction of a resilient supply chain. And what is completely unclear is what happens if China, in essence, comes backdoor into those supply chains as well, whether there's anything in even IPEF that would catch that or even notice it, given that it's not about tariffs or the rules of origin that go with tariffs.
Volunteer 2.
Question: would China and the EU like to support a strengthening of the WTO?
I would say absolutely yes. I mean, the European Union has been among the strongest pressing to have the dispute settlement fixed. And the EU has put forward a number of ideas about how to do that fix, and has really pushed very hard to say you need to fix the WTO, among other things, by starting with fixing the dispute settlement system. The EU has also put forward a lot of reform proposals on a number of other fronts where the WTO has been having trouble. So clearly the European Union is very engaged in trying to fix the WTO. And I think that the EU is very much still wanting to make sure that what they do complies with the WTO rules. I mean, for whatever else you can say about their carbon border adjustment mechanism, they have tried very hard to say that we're designing it a way that will be consistent with the WTO. Whether they've gotten there or not, we could debate, but they've clearly said that is the goal, is to have a WTO consistent process. On the China side, right now, I think China regards it, well, first of all, I think China is aware that it has been a huge winner by being in the WTO. I mean, just having China accede to the WTO and all that China gets by the rules that you cannot just discriminate against China, et cetera, China has won significantly by its membership in the WTO. And I think it cares about being considered a member in good standing of the WTO. It always tries to say, when we've lost disputes, we've complied. We are consistent with our WTO rules. The problem is, where is the fundamental problem? I mean, that slide I put up of the pulling apart. The problem is that a lot of what the WTO rules are about is, in essence, having a market-based economy. And a lot of what China pledged to do when it joined the WTO was to have its state-owned enterprises make all their decisions based on supply and demand and price, and not based on the Communist Party. And yet the reality is almost everything in China is dictated by the Communist Party and controlled by the Communist Party. These are very incompatible systems at the WTO, to have a market-based set of rules, market-based principles, and then to have China that does not operate on that system. So it's really hard to see how that comes back together again under the WTO system.
One of our remote participants, her question's gone now, her name was Rebecca, slightly recast the question just asked with a greater heat. It was, what would how would we expect China to react if a revamped WTO included some of the provisions you talked about earlier, carbon emissions, gender, labor. Increased labor rules?
So again, like I said, I think it is very important for China to be, and right now, I think China believes that it has the high road, if you will, in Geneva, because it is the United States that is considered the scofflaw. I mean, we are the ones that killed the appellate body, not China. There's been a couple of decisions that just came down in December where the United States imposed these 232 tariffs, these tariffs on steel and aluminum, and said that we did those for national security purposes. The United States also imposed a measure where they said goods that are made in Hong Kong have to be labeled made in China, because we take the view that in essence, China has taken over Hong Kong, has breached the agreement there. In both of those decisions, the United States said, you can't question us because we are invoking national security, and if we do something for national security purposes, you can't question it, you can't judge it, you have to accept my word for it that it's national security. And in both instances, panels, these part of the dispute settlement process said, okay, United States, explain to me how these measures actually fit within this national security exception, which governs nuclear materials, trade in arms, ammunitions, or implements of war, or has to be taken in a time of war or other emergency, international emergency. And the panels kept saying to the United States, tell me how these steel and aluminum tariffs or this Hong Kong business fits within one of those three boxes. Is it one of these three? And the United States kept saying, I don't have to answer that question. How dare you ask me? You're questioning my good faith. If I say it's national security, you put your pen down and go home. You accept that we have a national security defense to invoke. So immediately the panels basically said, no, United States, you didn't meet any kind of a proof, and therefore you are in violation of the WTO rules. And in both instances, the Biden administration immediately came out and said, we will not comply with this decision. You cannot judge our national security. So again, China and others are, if you will, on the high road and are saying, it is the United States that's the problem. So the hardest thing for China, I think, to accept are any rules that they perceive as singling them out, as treating them differently than everyone else. So from my perspective, the most important thing would be to figure out whether you can get a consensus of other countries on a lot of these things that I'm talking about, some of which are already in the WTO rules. So it isn't as though you're asking for a massive departure of the WTO rules. Again, some of the labor provisions, yes, those are very difficult. I think those would be hard. And right now, that is an area where there are not really WTO rules with respect to labor. Those are going to be hard. Some of the other issues, I would be more optimistic that if there were a general consensus, that you could get China to adhere to those rules.
I would only add, history shows us China will agree to just about anything as long as they can dictate the timeline for implementation.
You have a long time horizon, which is a
Yes,
power,
indeed.
right? And something Americans aren't as good at. Two? Oh, I'm sorry. Volunteer 3 has someone out there.
Well,
Yes,
All right,
Stefano Tijerina, University of Maine. This morning, President from Mexico, López Obrador, issued a decree that nationalizes lithium. Petro in Colombia, and Lula in Brazil, and Boric in Chile have also been looking at new ways of nationalizing or regionalizing key rare earth metals, which is the 21st century battle of the resources. And so I'm wondering, the future seems to be more protectionist than the other way around, and I want to see your opinions on that.
Thank you for asking that question. We will address this right now, but it's such a big development and interesting that I have a feeling it's also going to come, this issue, onto our larger panel in a few moments. But I don't know if you saw some of that news. It also has a certain edge here in Maine because some rare earths have been discovered very close to Camden, and there's some mining companies would like to get a hold of that, and there are some people here in Maine who don't want mining in this area. But
So my money's on the people who don't want the mining. I think they're going to win this one, but I've never lived in Maine. But that's just my guess.
you have some experience in New England, though.
But it's a great point. A great question, right? What's going to happen with the elements and the minerals that, at least based on aspiration, regulation, net zero 2010, 2020, 2050, 2060, whenever you're net zeroing, based on all those goals, the amount of copper, forget about lithium, the amount of copper that's going to be needed to achieve all of these zero carbon goals will make your head spin. The amount of lithium that will be required. So, two questions, right? What are the national security implications associated with the reserves themselves? In the case of Mexico, I mean, I can understand why they would nationalize it. They have a history of nationalization of certain, mineral and energy sectors. So, I mean, I think many other countries around the world are looking at their reserves of rare earths, lithium and even copper, and making these same decisions. But then there's also here in the US, where we have lots of mineral reserves, including lithium, questions about permitting and processing. So it's one thing to say, well, yes, we have tremendous amount of lithium, we have 50 years worth or 100 years worth, but it's another thing to approve and permit the plants and processing necessary to extract and develop that. And there's been a lot of talk recently about willingness and interest in doing that, but that's not the same as actually doing it. And experience shows us that the timeline necessary to do these things in the United States, even when people are willing to do it, set aside the mine in Camden, but a mine in Nevada, a processing plant in Utah, whatever it might be, it's measured in many years. And I think until we resolve that permitting and approval issue, and it was something that Joe Manchin sort of scratched the surface of barely in his negotiations with the Biden administration. Until we resolve this issue, we are going to live day to day reading stories about issues, concerns, shortages with regard to all of these important minerals, because we're on a path to consume them, turbines, batteries, grid storage, that I don't think anyone has really fully calculated.
Jennifer, I mean, we're not going to set you up to negotiate with the Mexicans on a breaking news story, but any early thoughts?
If I was going to send anyone to Mexico to negotiate, it would be Jennifer.
Now, I mean, again, I think it's a great question, and to me, it's perfect as the ending for this panel, because this is really where this rub comes in. I mean, in theory, the idea behind, trading rules and a rules-based trading system is to make sure that you can rely on your trading partners when you need them, that we can rely on Mexico or others when we need them, and that you will trade, that you will not hoard, that you will not put on controls that make it impossible for you to export. That's what the rules are supposed to do. And yet, again, your question goes to the heart of this, but what about when it's a national security issue? What about when it raises these other issues? Should you be able to break your rules, break the basic, commitments on trade because of the national security overlay here? So, I mean, I do think this is one, and this is one of many, that I think is going to become at the forefront of how do we square what is clearly going to be competing values. I mean, we used to understand the trading system's value base around that, comparative advantage, and its value base was around the economics. We are now going to have to look at a trading system that has values that are different, that includes national security as a high value priority, that includes some of these other things that I've been talking about this morning as part of the value system of the trading world. And we're not there yet in terms of trying to figure out how to create the right balance between what is going to be a much broader set of values that have to be at the table.
Solid topic to end this amazing Sunday session.